welcome to the Rare Slot. My name is Rands, and these are the bonus episodes of the Booster Pack podcast. Now, if you don't happen to know the Booster Pack, that's the show where I unwrap the stories and crack the mysteries of collectible games each and every episode. But here on the Rare Slot, we can have a little bit more of a casual conversation about a trading card or collectible card game related topic. Whether that's something I want to talk about, whether that's something that's maybe happening in the space at the time, or perhaps it's something that's been suggested by a listener. Now, today's topic came to us from a listener, but it very quickly entered into those other two categories as well, because I was very interested in talking about it almost immediately. And since setting up this conversation podcast record, I was very fascinated to learn that a major trading card game company has now announced that they're going to embrace this particular topic in the very near future. So before we jump headlong into this particular topic and introduce our very special guest today, let me just set up what we're going to be talking about. Now, over the last sort of 5 to 7-ish years, I've been building my own database for personal use of collectible trading card games from the world over. With the help of people online and people from around the world, it's actually been a fascinating little project. But what's interesting is in that particular list, there's about 450-ish games that have been released in English. And while I haven't played all of them, I probably played about 15 to 20% of them, maybe at best, I have looked into many of them. And what's interesting is they almost all exclusively posit the same challenge to their players. That is to amass a card pool of their very own cards, build a deck, and then sit down at a table with another card collecting deck building player or players if it's a multiplayer game, and use that deck to defeat everybody else there. Now, that shouldn't be surprising. That's something that's pretty commonplace in gaming, pretty much ubiquitous, in fact, this player versus player model. And what's interesting is that even pre-modern games like chess and poker and mahjong have always been about defeating other human opponents and proving that you're the best one there. However, interestingly, more and more recently, we've seen games with a different model come out in the hobby gaming space, and even in video games to a lesser extent. These games are ones that have specific mechanics or a specific way of using a subset of rules to allow you not to play the people around you, but to play the game itself, which can be done either by yourself or cooperatively with other people. Now, whether playing solo or with other players alongside you, these games are called player versus environment, or PvE games, in contrast to the PvP or player versus player games we talked about before. And the games themselves, they're called this because they create a world that presents challenges and conflicts in these games themselves. And that's what the players are playing against to win. Now, these two models are something that really fascinate me when it comes to collectible games, because almost exclusively we've seen collectible games use the player versus player model and not the other way around, using the player versus environment model. Very, very few have ever done that. So now, more recently, though, as player versus environment games have become more popular in the hobby space, there have been card games, fixed card games, or expandable card games, like the Lord of the Rings living card game or the Arkham Horror living card game, that have embraced this player versus player cooperative model. So that really does beg the question that these popular games can do it. Why haven't we seen more of this happening in the trading card game space? The other thing I'm really curious about is, do trading card games and cooperative experiences even mix well with the randomization model or all that sort of stuff? As well, the other thing that really sort of makes me interested is, does the underlying technique of player versus environment really speak to the way that collectible card games are sold, where it's a competitive sort of mindset, getting new cards, improving your deck, that sort of thing? Now, these are all questions I want to explore in this episode. And to join me in exploring these questions and even help me learn a little bit more about the history of PvE in collectible card games is that aforementioned very special guest who, as I said, was somebody who actually was the person suggesting this topic. Now, without further ado, I'm going to introduce them. And I actually consider this person somebody who I would think of as a student of tabletop gaming. They've played numerous games, board games, tabletop role-playing games, card games, both collectible and otherwise. This is somebody who even has their own blog that chronicles their journey as a tabletop game enthusiast. And that blog also chronicles their journey from enthusiast to card game creator. Yes, you might have guessed already, but our guest has actually recently designed their very own cooperative card game, one that hit over $200,000 on Kickstarter and will soon be available in a hobby store near you. That game is the Librarians adventure card game. And on top of all that, our guest also moonlights, or I guess in this case, sunlights, as a professor of molecular biology as well. I am delighted to welcome to the Booster Pack our very special guest, Brett Schofield. Brett, how do you do, man? Thanks for coming on the show.
I'm excellent. Thank you so much for that introduction. And, this is a really exciting topic. I'm so glad that we have an opportunity to sit down and discuss it today.
Me too. I'm so excited and enthusiastic. As I mentioned in the intro there, it's something that I've really sort of been in the back of my mind for a while. But when you brought this topic to me, it's been something that it really fascinates me that we haven't seen collectible games really embrace it. And as we're seeing a boom in the collectible game space at the moment for the first time since sort of the mid-90s, it would be interesting to see, as we mentioned before, there'll be some games that sort of embrace it and some games that don't, but I can't wait to sort of dig into it. However, before we do that, let's dig into your past before we dig into the past of collectible games. What is your personal history with collectible games? That's something that we often ask our guests on this show.
So I think like many gamers of my age, I started with Magic the Gathering. That was really a game that in fifth grade, so this would be like 94, 95, was how a lot of people socialized in my class. That you would actually, like, everyone who had cards would pull them out during lunch, and we would all sit in a single circle and play a giant multiplayer game with like 20 players, and we would never finish a game, but we would always start playing. That really kind of, introduced me to the genre, but I didn't really explore beyond it for a time. And then maybe in the 2000s, I discovered all of the games that had been put out in the 90s and just how many different ones there were and their different varieties. And so I played a lot of, well, at the time, they were dead CCGs, right? That they had no longer being supported. And I really got a chance to kind of explore a lot of these in a post-mortem kind of state. But as I got older, what I found is that my taste in gaming changed, and what I was looking for in a game changed, and who I was playing with changed. I started playing more and more with, like my the person who right now is my wife, or, people who I was close friends with, and we would frequently play games together. And so I started wanting more cooperative experiences where I and the people at the table were all playing together. And so that really led me into all of these cooperative card games where I wanted that card game play, but I wanted to feel like I was there at the table, going towards a common objective with people. So this took me to, like you were talking about, the Lord of the Rings, the card game, Arkham Horror. Currently there's Marvel Champions, games like that. And that led me into game design. So as mentioned, I'm the designer of the Librarians adventure card game.
I see you're representing there. That looks fantastic. You're wearing the shirt.
Yes, for podcast listeners, right? Wearing a librarian shirt. So, which is based on a TV and made-for-TV film franchise. But it's a cooperative game that's been published by Everything Epic Games and should be shipping out pretty soon.
Now we're going to dive deep into the cooperative game model in a second, but I do have to ask, I'm incredibly curious, was it always, when you created the game, were you always creating it as a singular box sort of expandable game, I guess, rather than any sort of the collectible game? Was that ever, so as you mentioned, you had all these influences from the 90s and stuff like that. Did you ever envision the game in that way, or was it always going to be like, right, no, I need this as a cooperative game?
I thought about it as an experience first, and then I wanted to leave it up to an actual publisher to determine how it was going to be distributed. That designers don't often get to have a lot of say in exactly how their product gets sold. So I was really focused on the experience, and I think there are reasons why the fixed game model or the living card game model allows you to deliver a complete experience in a single box. So I never really put a lot of thought into how could it be distributed in a collectible or randomized way.
So that's so interesting as well. Is obviously when you're pitching to a publisher and you're creating this sort of collective experience, and like you said, you took a lot of inspiration from the idea of sort of playing with people cooperatively in your life. Just as I'm sure that story resonates with a lot of people as we get older, our need to sort of prove ourselves better than one another sort of disappears, and that sort of multiplayer 20 on 20 game becomes less and less appealing. Now let's dive into the subject at hand here, because I could talk to you for ages about the game you created, but I really want to dig into this particular topic because I'm super excited, as we mentioned before. So I sort of led into the intro about sort of very loosely what PvE is, but I would love your perspective on how do you define PvE? What's your working definition of it? And how do you see it diverging from sort of traditional collectible card game play?
Yeah, so I think it's important for us to talk about this early. Partially this is my academic background showing through, right? I always want to define my terms, what make sure that we're speaking the same language. And I think you did a really great job of introducing these two different modes. But as far as I can tell from some cursory internet searches, these terms, player versus environment and player versus player, originate from the video game space with multi-user dungeons or MUDs, where the question is, now that you have a game where multiple people are playing together at the same time, where does the conflict for the game arise? As in, all games are about doing something. And so that goal that you're trying to accomplish, is that set by other players? Are you trying to stop players from reaching their goals, or are you just trying to beat them up, or is it another player who's providing you that goal, or is it the environment of the game? So when we think about environment, think about like, as you're wandering around the game, you find monsters that are not controlled by players, they're controlled by the game itself, and that gives you the challenge. Now, for a podcast, where I know some people are going to be just listening to this, I find the terms PvE and PvP to sound so similar to each other that they're hard to distinguish. So I'll kind of use the words cooperative for a PvE experience, where you're playing either with the other players at the table or perhaps in a solo capacity. And then for the player versus player, I'll tend to refer to that as competitive.
Great idea to distinguish those two particular things. Absolutely, because I've definitely in my time mixed up the two as well when saying them very quickly. So yeah, let's stick with cooperative and competitive for now, especially in those particular terms. So I did want to just pull out something there. Obviously, you mentioned that it comes from the video game space, and I actually should qualify my own terms. When we're talking about collectible or trading card games on this particular episode, we are talking specifically about those games in a physical space, because there have been cooperative trading card games in the digital space. Things like the original Soul Forge had a PvE element, and many other games as well that currently exist do. I believe, obviously, things like Slay the Spire is a really famous example, Inscription, some really popular collectible card games in the digital space. But we're talking exclusively today about the physical space and how these two different models, which come, as you mentioned, from video games, impact our perspective on physical trading card games. So that's really interesting. So we've obviously talked about cooperative, and we've sort of defined sort of where the terms have come from. But tell me, like, other than the things that we've sort of outlined so far, are there any other major differences between those two terms?
Sure. Well, I think the core difference gets back to that question of, where does the opposition come from? Like, what are you trying to struggle against? For a cooperative or player versus environment circumstance, the game itself is providing you the challenge necessary, versus the competitive, that challenge is coming from another player. And so when you're thinking about game design, if you are thinking about a cooperative game, you have to have a game or a rule system that allows you to provide challenge to players. And that's a very, very different thing than just saying, well, you've got another player who you're playing against. They're presumably, they have a pulse and are breathing and can provide you with opposition. versus the cooperative, where the game system has to be designed in a way where it can provide the challenge.
It's interesting you mentioned that. Now, I did want to just call out something there, and just to sort of clarify as well, because I love discussing this sort of minutia. I sort of mentioned it. You have obviously played a bunch of role-playing games, and that is about a team of people, but a dungeon master sort of sitting atop that sort of team of people. Would you consider role-playing as the general form cooperative, or a player versus player experience?
So when I run games, my goal is to tell an interesting story. And so I see myself as actually being on the side of the players. And yes, I'm setting up opposition in front of them, but the opposition is there to allow us to tell a good story. But I think there are game masters, and I think I've encountered some as well, who really see themselves as, I'm the opposition, I'm the villain. My job is to, provide you that challenge, because without that challenge, then why are we even here in the role-playing setting? So I think role-playing, I would put it more on the cooperative side of the spectrum, right? Because honestly, these are not just two separate categories that we're talking about. It's really a spectrum from fully cooperative to fully competitive. So I would put it more on the cooperative side, with some player versus player elements to them.
So basically, I wanted to just dig into that, because I would just love our listeners to sort of have a perspective on something that they might be a little bit more familiar with. Now, building off of that, speaking of the familiarity, like, where do we currently see like PvP in sort of hobby games or hobby card games? Like, where is that living at the moment, and what are some other examples outside of role playing that we might see this type of game?
I think it's primarily outside the hobby card game market. So cooperative games are a huge dominant force in the board game industry. So I know, a lot of people who listen in play both card and board games, and it's interesting that with card games, I think it's niche, as we'll get into and talk about. But for the board game industry, it's become one of the major pillars that industry is built on, to the point where I think a lot of games, even if it's a competitive game, feel the need to create solo modes in order to draw more people in. It's like you'll see these games, and it's a 3 to 5 player, highly social game with a solo mode.
Yeah, you can only be so solo in that particular, it's social in a solo setting.
So I think that has to be acknowledged first, is that it's a huge dominant force in a related market. For card games, I think where we primarily see it is in these expandable card games, right? The living or expandable card games. And obviously the big three by Fantasy Flight Games that we've already talked about, Lord of the Rings, Arkham Horror, and Marvel Champions, are dominant players in that. But there's a lot of players outside of that, including some really intriguing new titles coming up. I mean, obviously the one that I designed, but I'm really excited about Earthborn Rangers as an example of a card game that is sold in that fixed model that is cooperative. As far as for the collectible card game industry, there's a number of games that have toyed with it. Things like Magic the Gathering, Pokemon, Flesh and Blood. But I think we'll kind of dive into those in a little more detail. But suffice it to say, it's a little bit more of a rarity in the collectible card game market.
I would 100% agree. Like you said, there have been games that have sort of, almost like we were talking about with the board games a moment ago, sort of slivered in this little subsection of solo or player versus environment capacity. Maybe they've sold extra sets or something like that, but we'll dive a little bit into that. But what I'm really interested in is, as the show has always proven, the history of these sort of collectible card games. So let's dig into sort of like where we first started seeing these modes and models in the collectible game space. So can you tell me what, like, going all the way back as far as you can, what sort of games you remember having these sort of elements? You've sort of explored these games throughout, once they became dead games, much like I did, they became really cheap. So it was something I was really excited to engage with. So at that point, like where do you really see these sort of PvE in CCGs or TCGs existing prior to sort of where we are currently?
Yeah, so this is where we start entering dangerous space, because you and I both love the history so much that we can just kind of go on and on and on forever. But whenever we're talking about the history of collectible card games, we have to start with the grandfather, right? The progenitor of the entire industry. So Magic the Gathering comes on the scene, and it spawns this whole industry that continues to this day. And I think it set the standard for what a collectible card game was going to look like. And that's not to say every card game looks like Magic, but I think a lot of them share some commonalities that Magic dictated. So one of these is that it's a two-player game. Obviously, there are plenty of multiplayer games. One of my favorite card games is Vampire: The Eternal Struggle, right? Obviously designed around 4 or 5 players. But I think the majority of games in the collectible game market are for 2 players. The other thing that Magic set is that it's a competitive game, right? You are going up against your opponent. And then finally, kind of germane to our conversation, is the idea that you win by defeating your opponent. As in, I win by killing you, or beating you up, or destroying your space stations, or taking your stuff, right? That it's an antagonistic relationship between the players. It's not just I win specifically by making you lose.
There are some examples of it, but there are very few games that you win not by defeating your opponent but achieving a goal in and of yourself. So obviously, people will think of things like combo decks in collectible card games and stuff, and other specific games where it is a race for sort of victory points. But you're right, Magic sort of forged that space where it was about that antagonistic relationship, that punishing your opponent through the cards that you have. Now, let's circle back to sort of like where we've seen, so obviously Magic sort of created this model. And let's circle back to where we've seen PvE, because Magic in those early days didn't feature any sort of player versus environment sort of situation. So what are some examples that we sort of saw early on that diverged from that model that Magic presented in? It then maybe leaned, maybe not fully into the PvE space, but like in that direction.
Yeah, and I really like the way you phrased that question, right? Where we're not looking for a completely cooperative / solo game. What we're looking for are, where are some of the elements needed to get us there? Where do they start popping up? And I think the first step is not necessarily the first in a linear way, but kind of the first step for a game is to reconceptualize, how do you win, right? How does victory achieve? So you brought up the idea of winning by victory points, right? That I think about this as like a race, right? If we're both racing, one of us is going to win because we got there first, but I didn't, that didn't make you, I didn't destroy all your stuff and make you come in last. I didn't like take your life down to 0. I simply got there first, or I was able to rack up the most number of points. So there's a lot of games that do this, and a lot of these games have ways of like slowing your opponent down by like playing cards that hurt them, but still the objective is for you to rack up more points. So like some examples of this are like Buffy the Vampire Slayer CCG from 2001, where you are, both players are trying to protect the town from all these crazy supernaturals that show up. And the question is, who's able to protect the town in the most efficient way? Like who does it best? Nightmare Before Christmas is another example where you're both just trying to build the best Halloween town. And yes, there are things you can do to harm your opponent as they build their Halloween town, but it's still who has the best town at the end versus who's dead and who's still alive. So that reframing of the victory conditions is, I think, a necessary step that starts shifting you towards cooperative games.
So often the thing that I find so interesting about cooperative games is they do take that sort of more passive angle for victory, especially when it comes to, more further down the lines for all players or whatnot. But when we're talking about board games, even things like Euro games, Settlers of Catan, even something a little bit more commonplace like Ticket to Ride, it's about racking up points, and you're not interfering with your opponents necessarily, except for the fact that you're both using the same set of resources, whether that's tracks or whatnot. Now, that's sort of mechanically sort of where we find PvE. Like this is eventually, as we get down to it, we'll sort of realize that these sort of elements are something that are really common in PvE games. But often, is there any sort of collectible card games that embrace a more thematic sort of sense for collectible card games, or something that's more thematically PvE? Because you're in those games examples, you're still trying to beat your opponent, but you're beating them through this sort of circumvented sort of story. There's 2 towns in Buffy, or there's 2 towns in Nightmare Before Christmas. Like, is there anything more thematic than that?
Yeah. So this next category, I have a little bit of a hard time describing it, but the idea is that in a game, you, the player, are represented in some way. So in Magic, you are a planeswalker, and you are the one who's throwing the fireballs or summoning the creatures, right? So you are like your avatar in the game is the one who's defeating the opponent and the opponent's avatar. So it's a very personal, like, I run over to you with a sword and hit you until you go down.
In opposed to, say, something like in Star Wars or Star Trek, where it's you're a nebulous force. Sorry, pardon me.
No, Star Trek's a fantastic example of what I'm talking about, where in the Star Trek CCG, the idea is that, let's say you and I are playing a game against each other. Well, both of us are building a crew and a ship that's going to go explore the galaxy and find strange new worlds and things like that. But when I show up at this strange new world, something weird happens, right? Like an episode of Star Trek plays out. So we beam down to the planet, and Wesley Crusher gets knocked over on the lawn, and the locals want to kill Wesley Crusher, right? That's the setup. Well, in the game sense, the whole reason that happened is because you played a card on me that said, the locals arrest one of your crew members and want to execute them. But that wasn't you, right? It wasn't like your captain called the locals on the phone and said, hey, there's these guys coming, they're no good, arrest them and execute them on sight.
Yeah, I got no problem with Wesley at all.
So this is just something that happened during the mission. And it happened because you had a card in your deck, but it wasn't you, it wasn't who you represent in the game doing it to me. So I think about this as, on your turn, you're the hero, and that's who you are. Like that's who you represent in the game. And then on your opponent's turn, you now stop being you, and you're now this nebulous force that's stopping the opponent from doing something. I think a really, really good example of this is the Lord of the Rings, either the Decipher trading card game or the Middle-earth CCG, where you are the Fellowship, right? Or Middle-earth CCG, right? You are one of the Astari wizards. So Radagast doesn't get on the phone to his orc buddies and say, hey, go beat up Gandalf for me. But your deck has orc cards in it that you play to try to slow Gandalf down, right? So that is now a reframing that the bad things that happen to your opponent are not because of who you represent in the game. So this is now allowing us to start thinking a little differently about what am, quote unquote, I doing in the game versus just what is happening to the opposition.
So that brings me to a really interesting thought, because obviously there is a bunch of games that sort of use that Lord of the Rings model, that sort of similar model. Going as far back as sort of 1995, there was things like Redemption, where on your turn you're playing the evangelical forces of the Lord, and then on the other turn you're playing these demonic sort of sinning forces and stuff like that. There's things like like a personal favorite game that I like, and that I mentioned on my top 5 was the Sailor Moon trading card game, where in that one you're playing the Sailor Scouts, and you're also then on the other turn sort of playing the Negaverse, or whatever the bad guys were called in that particular game. And this sort of is something that you see commonly. Now, what you're doing, I guess, as a player, is you've sort of triggered this idea, is when you think about cooperative games, you know, something like Pandemic comes to mind, and you're simulating sort of the role that the deck in Pandemic sort of plays as being like, oh, these are these cards, you know, we all know about the card advantage resource. These cards, this is how many I have to play as basically like the interference deck. And then this is how many I have to play as my actual character. It's really fascinating to hear that in the parallel that I've never thought about before with this sort of player versus environment model.
Well, and I think a lot of these games actually have fan-made solo rules, or solo/cooperative rules to them, because somebody realized very quickly, well, I could take all those bad guy cards and put them into a new deck, and now I could have a true player versus environment experience where that deck is now providing me the opposition that I need. So these are not cooperative games, but they are games that fans have found ways of very easily transitioning into cooperative games.
See, that's so fascinating. I mean, that even reminds me of one, like recently I was looking into the Guardians collectible card game, and there was, you know, fan-made models for playing solo for that, because it's very grid-based and stuff like that, so you can create your own sort of environment very easily to play against in that particular sense. So that sort of makes me curious. We talked about sort of these elements that sort of remind us of cooperative play that we've sort of seen more recently in these early games. But do you have any sort of examples where there is direct, you know, player versus environment, or, you know, cooperative gameplay in early collectible card games?
Yeah, so, you know, a lot of these games that we've already discussed have these fan-made solo or co-op variants, but there are also games that the designers or the publishers created, I guess, official, right, with air quotes, modes that were either solo or co-op. And some of these games kind of got a reputation for primarily being a solo game. So a great example of this is the Tomb Raider Ccg from 1999, where the idea is that you are playing, I guess you're exploring a map of cards that is kind of like a Tomb Raider level. And just like playing the video game, you're going to come across enemies and you're going to be finding loot. And so the idea is, how much loot can you find? And in a standard game, I guess you can attack the other players who are wandering around the same level. But there's also monsters. So you can play it solo just by having the monsters that the game provides being the opposition for you. I think where this really sees its zenith is the World of Warcraft trading card game. So this is a game that buys into all of Magic's kind of core assumptions, at least the ones that we've discussed, right? 2-player, competitive, you win by beating your opponent senseless. But they quickly released what they call raid decks, which creates a one versus many environment where, you know, kind of like a role-playing game, right? 3, 4, 5 players might get together and be joining forces against my mega deck, right? And then they took it even one step beyond that. In, I guess, 2011, they introduced something called a dungeon deck, where now someone doesn't have to control the bad guy deck, right? Now it is just playing itself out. And I believe these were all based off of different instances you could do in the video game, right? So you're playing through a card game version of this video game experience, but now you're doing it like you would in the video game in a cooperative way, you and some friends against the game itself.
I guess that always begs the question, have there ever been any collectible card games that are only primarily this sort of solo play in themselves? Like, has there ever been something that's a true PvE experience or cooperative, not even cooperative, solo experience in a collectible card game?
So I initially assumed that there would be no games in this category, right? As I'm going through and doing my research and digging through, you know, I thought I knew about a lot of card games, and I start finding out about these super obscure ones. So I had initially assumed that there would be no games that were made to be cooperative first and foremost. And I found out that there's actually a game from 1997, so really early, called Age of Heroes, which is apparently designed to be solo and can be played with more than one player. But so I've never played this game, but my understanding from reading about it is that when you play with multiple players, it's like each of you is playing your own separate game side by side. And you have decks of cards that are the monsters and the treasure and the spells and all these different things. And when you walk into a room that is once again a card, it kind of tells you, you know, grab this many monsters and that much treasure and things like that. So that is the only example of that I could find of a game that was designed for either solo or cooperative play and had no competitive mode available. There's probably a fan-made mode. I don't know how many fans there are of this game. I guess the other example that I found, I guess I just said that was the only, but there's one that has an asterisk on it because there was a game in 2010 called Dungeon Crawler that sounds exactly the same, but it's from a very small publisher. And apparently after their first print run, they immediately moved to a living card game, expandable card game style model. So I don't know how long that game actually existed as a collectible game.
So it's so interesting because neither of those games I specifically have any personal experience with. I recognize both the titles and I'm sure I've seen them, you know, cards and stuff like that, but it's so interesting. Do you happen to know in Age of Heroes, just to, you know, support the conversation we've had so far, do players, when they are trying to play sort of side by side, what's the victory condition there for those players?
Well, I think the victory condition is the same as solo. I feel like I'm starting to talk about things I don't fully understand. But my understanding is that each player has their own separate victory conditions. So it really is like I'm playing solo, but I'm sitting next to you and you're playing solo. And maybe there's a small amount of ability to affect, you know, I didn't see any rules when I was looking through the rule book for I attack a monster that's threatening you. So I concluded from that it's truly just side by side solo.
We might be introducing this whole new world of sort of two-headed giant solo gameplay. We might be forging something forward here. So I guess, you know, there's been such limited examples, and I can think of a few other examples, obviously, throughout collectible game history that had those sort of little nuggets of sort of PvE sort of tacked on or whatnot. But like you said, there's nothing really that was made for that in this space. Now, that sort of begs the question. We do have quite a few living games, and you sort of mentioned it earlier where we were talking a little bit about how, you know, there are some games that have dabbled in it. So what current or sort of living trading card games, you know, so either the big three or maybe big four now, depending on the perspective, have utilized PvE cooperative gameplay or even solo per player versus environment gameplay into their games previously?
Well, you know, first of all, I'm so glad that you brought up digital card games because I think it needs to be mentioned at least briefly that most games that were created for a digital space, like Hearthstone as an example, have ways of playing against an AI opponent. So it's not like they've necessarily designed the game in a different way. It's just that because it's a computer game, you can have an AI system playing as if it were a player. And so a lot of current, it might be all or nearly all current digital card games have a way, even if it's just training for like how, like learning the game, they have a way to play against an AI opponent. So that would be a cooperative, or I guess in this case, a solo experience. As far as physical games go, Magic the Gathering obviously has to be brought up on this list, but they're an interesting case because they released a number of decks called challenge decks, which work, a little bit like if you took all the bad cards from, like a Lord of the Rings game and made a separate deck with just all those bad guy cards, where this challenge deck represents some sort of, that this was like the Greek mythology set, so some sort of a mythological creature like a Hydra or something, and cards are coming off this deck to represent different aspects of the Hydra, and then you have to fight against it. But as far as I know, they dabbled with it in, around that set, and to my knowledge, they haven't done anything with it since then.
I think you're right there. I mean, I know, anyway, we're talking about fan-supported formats and stuff like that. I've heard that Magic has a special format that I think you can find, people playing online and stuff, called the Horde, where it's basically like a special zombie deck that somebody's constructed where it has, zombie tokens coming out constantly. But it's so interesting that there hasn't been a way that Wizards of the Coast or Magic the Gathering has really, in a mass market sort of sense, embraced these particular types of games. Because if I'm not mistaken, those challenge decks were tied into pre-releases that were sort of thematically tied after, the Greek labors of Hercules or something like that.
Yeah, that's my understanding as well. So as far as like the major players in the industry, Magic, I think, was kind of the first to dabble with it, but then very quickly moved on. And at least I haven't heard of any announcements that they intend to pick it back up. Some of the other big players in the industry started toying with this early in the pandemic. So presumably they already had this, like, presumably you can't just, you all go home, you're all in lockdown, and overnight you just magically create a PvE mode, right? Presumably that didn't happen. So presumably they were working on it pre-pandemic, but then they saw the pandemic as a really good opportunity to launch these. So Pokemon has raid battles. And my understanding is that raid battles are print and play cards that allow you to fight against super powered Pokemon.
So it's very interesting that we mentioned before how these PvE or cooperative experiences, much like World of Warcraft sort of a dungeon deck or even raid decks, sort of featured this similar mechanic. My understanding is, to furthermore your point where it was like they might have had this in the works, I believe the Pokemon video games at that stage were dabbling with a similar sort of thing where multiple players could play against some sort of giant, Pokemon in a raid sort of sense. So it's so fascinating to see that influence come in yet again from another video game franchise.
Absolutely. So about that same time, I'm not sure that Keyforge counts as a current or living card game anymore. I don't really know what the status of that is. But the reason I bring it up is that 2020 is also when they released Keyforge Adventures, which are, once again, these print and play packs of cards where you are playing your standard Keyforge deck, but now you're playing it against this environmental hazard. So, a giant kraken coming up from the depths of the ocean, and you have to try to fight them off using your standard Keyforge decks. And then finally, the one that, we can talk a little bit about, but we don't know much about it, is Flesh and Blood. So maybe, a few weeks ago, the Flesh and Blood 2.0 announcement came out, where they're not changing the rules of the game, they're changing the support structures and the distribution of the game. And one of the things that their article talked about that they really want to put an emphasis on is cooperative play, specifically trying to target more casual players or players who love the game and want to be part of the game, but aren't necessarily the people going to these, $10,000 cash prize tournaments, but who are still part of the community and a valued part of the community, and who might be underserved currently by the play structures that company has in place.
So it's so interesting. And I alluded to that sort of in the introduction when I sort of spoke about there was a company that's sort of dabbling in this space. And that is something that I feel like that really does need to be embraced, and I think can really take some of the lessons that we've learned from modern trading card games, especially the big ones we've talked about. You know, you said Pokemon dabbled in this space, but where it's really interesting, you know, we were talking earlier about, you know, you wanting to play a different style now that you'd sort of grown up and stuff like that. And you wanted to play more communally with people around you. And something that I've noticed has obviously changed over the last sort of 10 or 15 years is that Magic the Gathering has sort of become more of a multiplayer game with the Commander format. And that's something that I think is really valuable when we look at sort of these multiplayer cooperative experiences that Flesh and Blood seems to posit to be offering, because it obviously, you know, we talked about it not really being impactful to the sort of competitive Pro Tour side of things, but it really does help the game serve a wider audience who might be just, you know, for lack of a better term, kitchen table players who might not be interested in engaging in the game and sort of keeping up with every new set that comes out, but want to sort of embrace this experience and love the way that the game plays. I'm so excited to hear officially now that there is some major trading card game really looking to dig into this side of gaming. And I can't wait to see how not only it goes, but how it influences not only the other major players, but this sort of new renaissance of collectible games.
Yeah, so, you know, honestly, Flesh and Blood is something that I looked at with interest in understanding how the whole industry is moving forward. But now with this announcement, I really want to try the game that I've read a lot about, and it sounds like a fascinating game. But it's this announcement for PvE that's really pushing me over the edge of saying, oh well, maybe I would like to play this game now too. So I'm really looking forward to learning more about what they have in mind and then actually the release of it.
So that's so interesting because, you know, as we've said, you know, like it was a game that came out. It's also in the same fantasy genre. You know, some people are going to observe it as being something that's similar to Magic. But if you can get decks of Flesh and Blood, whether they're pre-constructed or even booster packs and stuff like that, and engage in the hobby the way, you know, we do with collectible games, but still offer it in that PvE experience that we mentioned before, where you can play it with your, you know, your wife and your friends and stuff like that in a less competitive capacity, maybe even emulating some of those, you know, RPGs or something that we talked about before, or perhaps dungeon decks or something. I'm really excited about that as well. But obviously, considering all of that stuff that we just said, what do you think are some of the values that PvE could add to some of the major players or just in collectible games in general?
So let me give you my thoughts, but then I'm actually going to be really interested to hear your thoughts about this as well, because I think that PvE can add a lot to a game, and I think it's going to add something different for different players. So for me, I think that most card games are designed with the competitive scene in mind. And that's reasonable, right? You want to make sure that the cards are balanced for that competitive scene. If you have organized play, you want to, you know, really focus on bringing players together for these big tournaments and things like that. But I think that a lot of companies have forgotten that the audience who engages with that top level competitive environment is actually a small slice of the overall community. If we look at the number of people playing Magic versus the number of people going to, I don't know, pre-releases or you know, large tournaments, there's a lot more players than there are who are engaging in these big tournaments. And so I think PvE offers the opportunity to snag players who aren't interested in that super high level competitive play, right? If we think about like sports are a great example, right? Not every sporting activity has to be trying to go for the Olympics or trying to, you know, for the World Cup, right? People are allowed to play a sport and enjoy the sport just for the joy of playing it, as opposed to the joy of being a high-level competitor. And high-level competition is great. It's just not why everybody does something. And so PvE, I think, offers people who want to experience the game, but not necessarily through the lens of, you know, how can I spend hours every day digging on internet forums to figure out, you know, the very best cards in the current meta and the strategies against them. And which decks are likely to make an appearance at this tournament, it gives those players a way of engaging with the game, and it revitalizes that part of the community. So I guess what do you think? Like, what are some of the advantages in your mind for taking an existing game and adding a PvE component to it?
So that really excites me, and as you mentioned, I fully agree with your statement there, where it's, there is this unserviced, for many years, Magic the Gathering looked at their people who are going to Friday Night Magic, people who are going to Pro Tours, people who are going to GP as their metric for players. And that all shifted when sort of Commander took over. And I'm just using them as an example. Obviously, games like Pokemon have always lived in this more casual space. There are so many more people who buy Pokemon cards, from kids to adults to, presents for birthday parties and all that sort of stuff. And Pokemon has been so much more aware of that and focuses their energy on creating fun and exciting sets that way. Whereas Magic focused for so many years on that competitive play. And then that started to change with Commander products and all that sort of thing. But where I think that the true value really adds in is yes, building that community, building those sort of gaming groups that we've sort of have so interesting. If you look at gaming, the standard gaming group nowadays sort of has evolved out of the collectible card games, some people theorize, because people used to get together to play their Magic or their Battlestar Galactica collectible card, not Battlestar, Battlestar Galactica or Babylon 5 collectible card game, or whatever collectible card game on Friday nights. And then eventually those games died out, be it Lord of the Rings or whatever, and then they substituted board games. So there's a lot of theory that those sort of games supported the way that board games have grown over the years, because those groups sort of solidified. Now, what I think is really interesting and what would be really valuable for this sort of PvE or sort of cooperative sort of nature of collectible card games, especially ones that have existed already, games like Flesh and Blood, games like Magic, games like Pokemon, is it gives a whole new level of utility for the cards that already exist. So not only are they going to be able to capture new fans, it's going to bring a new value for some of the cards that were otherwise, not seen as competitively viable, because they weren't good cards that really pushed, they just became common bulk. But there is the opportunity that in PvE, there might be fringe cases or things that they can build in, where cards that would otherwise just seen as not as good as other card X might be able to actually help and engage this sort of these old sort of cards and bring more relevance to them. Because one of the biggest issues I find is, once a card is deemed non-competitive, it sort of falls by the wayside. And it's something that in collectible games really, really frustrates me, that there is so much bulk that I'm sure people who listen to this show have, that they don't really use on a regular basis. And I feel like, while this is more blue sky vision for the system, I feel like there could be a way that could embrace sort of cards and encourage people to go back through other particular opportunities, especially if the game is somewhat divergent from the sort of two-player PvP model or competitive model, as we've decided to call it, that we're sort of used to. So it might add a whole new layer and context to the game. The other thing as well is, obviously, I fully agree that it will bring more people to the game who are more minded in the sense that they just want to enjoy a fun game experience. And it really will validate collectible games, hopefully, in that sort of sense that they might see the sort of people, they might see the market that sort of embrace with board games, that embrace with Arkham Horror in this sort of capacity. And it really, opening cards is fun. So randomized cards is a really cool way to sort of engage with anything you love. So I'm super excited to see what comes of it. And I think that it's really, really valuable for companies to start thinking about this. And like I said before, I can't wait to see what the impact is in the collectible game space moving forward.
Well, and I'm so glad that you talked a little bit about giving new life to old cards, because honestly, that's what we hope from good design, right? A new card comes out and you're like, oh, now this other card that was worthless has new life. Or has new value as a combo piece or as a synergy. And so new formats do the same thing. And the beauty of a PvE format, I think, is that it could be ever changing and ever evolving. So, we'll talk about this probably in a little bit, but how PvE is often so narrative based, where different PvE scenarios have different mechanics, perhaps, or different ways that you need to defeat or progress through that story. And so it could be that a card that is not so useful in a competitive sense is really required for specific modes of the PvE experience.
And that's exactly what I was getting at. And I'm so glad you used that word scenario, because that's something that we see in those, aforementioned Fantasy Flight games. We see cards that are specifically built around particular narratives that sort of engage in a specific type of play. So, there might be just to take Magic as an example or whatever, there might be a Pacific Magic card that gives you 4 life that isn't really interesting in a particular competitive game. As we know, life isn't the real resource of that game. But in a specific scenario where it says every time you gain life, you do damage to this, unholy demon beast or something like that, that makes that card more relevant again and very, very exciting. And I think that, like I said, I hate to see bulk just sit in cupboards and stuff like that and be deemed unplayable forevermore. So I am super excited to see that. But it sort of leads me to the question, we've sort of passed out these sort of ideas of why we think cooperative play or PvE or player versus environment play would be so useful in a collectible game format. Why don't you think we've seen more collectible games in sort of a wider capacity in utilizing PvE?
Yeah, so this is a really, really good question. I think the way that any answer has to start is that we're crossing into the realm of speculation. That it would be great if we could get one of the execs from Wizards of the Coast and sit them down and say, like, well, you tried this in 2013. Why has it stopped? But if we take a look at the games that have dabbled in it before, those games, be it Magic through their challenge decks or something like Keyforge through Adventures, or even World of Warcraft TCG through the dungeon decks. The environment, right? Whatever it is that's providing the opposition has come in a fixed format. It has not come in a randomly distributed format. You don't buy a booster pack and say, oh, now I'm going to have a red dragon in my dungeon, right? The game that you are playing against so far has been something that is a narrative experience, right? You're playing a story. That story could be a specific environment or a specific dungeon that you're going through, or it could be a murder mystery, or whatever it is. There's a specific story that the designer has in mind, and you are being sold a complete package that has that story in it. So I guess what my point is that you now have a game that is a random distribution game that has non-randomized products that you have to buy in order to play this alternate mode.
So that's so interesting. That's to bring up a point. And again, to lean into Magic, just obviously because it casts such a long shadow and has tried so many different things. Obviously, there's things like starter decks and theme decks and planeswalker decks and tournament decks that all feature fixed product. And as well, there's even sort of like board game adjacent type products that feature sealed Magic decks in them that you're not even supposed to customize. You can just play straight out of the box. So it's not something that's really hasn't been tried before in the sort of way that you posit it, sort of similar to what the living card game model has seen. And perhaps, that's why we're seeing it more in the player versus environment thing, more in that particular space at the moment.
I think where the difference lies is that in a starter deck, say, you are putting together cards that you designed to be part of your normal set, right? Part of your normal experience. And you're just saying, which of these cards do I want to compile into this product? For a PvE product, you are creating everything brand new. So those cards cannot be sold in, or at least the way it's been done, those cards are not sold in booster packs. Those cards are only sold in the fixed dungeon pack. You won't ever experience those cards in the randomized boosters. And so you have to put a lot of design time and development time into something that people are going to buy once, and all the art and all of those things that went into creating that product. Now you only are able to sell that one deck. You're not able to put it into boosters. You're not able to reap the benefits of your randomized model.
Absolutely. So that really makes me curious because, you mentioned before, we are in the realm of speculation because we are sort of thinking forward about what is possible in this space and how the impact of the particular games would go. So my question is, do you think that even if it was, placing one of those scenario cards in every booster pack or just having them mixed in with the commons or something like that in amongst a more successful game would be successful? And furthermore, we spoke about that Age of Heroes before, which came initially in randomized sets. How do you think that game's, player versus environment model was impacted via the fact that it was sold in randomized capacities?
Yeah, so, right now, if we look at all of the games that are either PvE or have PvE elements, the thing that's really driving a player to experience that PvE environment or PvE experience is the narrative that has been set aside for it, right? That you are in this big boss battle against something, or you are going and solving this murder mystery, whatever the story is. And I think those stories, that narrative, does not lend itself to a randomized format. I mean, imagine taking a novel and cutting it up into pages. You get a random booster pack of pages. But that narrative model is not the only way you can do PvE. And so I think that PvE by a randomized distribution is possible, but not with this scripted and sculpted narrative idea that we've been using so far. So once again, if we look at video games for inspiration, there is the entire genre of roguelikes, where you are proceeding through a procedurally generated dungeon or environment with monsters that just pop up. And the question is, how long can you make it through, right? How good are your skills? Can you make it to the 10th floor or, whatever it is that you're doing? And I think a roguelike, something that is supposed to be random, supposed to be procedurally generated, could work with now I randomly have this card, so it will randomly show up in the dungeon.
But that really asks the question, how does the competitive nature and the competitive nature of CCGs specifically, that sort of drives that randomized sale. Like if I'm sitting at home and I've already got my, my adventure deck and I'm like, all right, this is where my deck's at. And I don't need to buy any more cards for my own personal deck. And I don't need to buy any more cards for my adventure deck because I feel like those two elements are balanced. Does the randomization drive that? Like usually people are driven to buy collectible games through the fact that they want better cards to be able to play in the near future. But if I've got a static environment and I'm like, okay, I've just got my challenge deck and I've just got my own personal deck, do you think that the collectible model would be successful with keeping that in mind?
So yeah, this is again a really nice question that gets into like player psychology and why do people buy products and why come back to the same product when there are so many games out there. Why return to buy more Magic? Why not switch to another game, a different board game, go outside and play football? So I think that the competitive games traditionally have relied on that competitive scene as a driving force to get people to just keep thinking about the game and talking about the game and buying and playing your game. You show up at Friday Night Magic and some players put together this new cool deck and you're like, wow, that, really beat me quickly. I'm going to go home and I'm going to tech against it and see if, what sort of cards I can put in so that next Friday I show up and maybe I've got the edge on that player. But once again, we come back to there could be other forces that drive players through the game. So things, that the cooperative games like Arkham Horror, I think use the narrative to drive players through of saying, don't you want to come back for the next chapter? It's almost like these old serialized novels where you get them every month in a magazine. You get a new chapter of like, oh, what's going to happen to the hero this time, except the hero is you, and it's your choices that are going to drive forward what happens. So I think if you are looking at a PvE style game or a cooperative game, and you want to kind of play it out the way we were talking before of doing a randomized distribution model and having cards that, it function more like a roguelike, I think that brings up this question of what makes players come back. Is it just finding that next crazy enemy to defeat? What is it that drives players back? And I'm not sure I have a good answer to that. I'm not sure the industry has a good answer to it right now. And I think that's why we haven't seen a roguelike game where you're buying random packs of cards that define your deck and the dungeon.
Now, what I want to pull out there, you mentioned the roguelike games and you mentioned sort of Friday Night Magic and stuff like that. And a huge component of the randomization of collectible games is limited play. Basically not building your deck and coming to a specific reason to be like, all right, this is how I'm going to play this. But, you said there that, there's going to be these two elements, like you're going to have the sort of the challenge deck and your own deck. Do you feel like a randomized PvE or cooperative experience could exist in a limited capacity? Perhaps you open a booster pack and 50% of the cards you don't look at, you stick them in a pile, and for every person playing, those cards, the enemy cards get sort of shuffled about and sort of draft in that capacity. Like, how do you feel like limited works if you're talking about this fringe sort of subject, which is randomized cooperative, trading card games?
I think that's a really good question. And I think it points to, if we look at other cooperative card games, and I'm gonna kind of look at Fantasy Flight here for their living card games. I don't think they ever figured out, to this day, I do not think they have figured out what their organized play, how it's supposed to serve their cooperative games. I hear from people who've played their competitive games like Legend of the Five Rings that they didn't do a particularly good job with organized play with those either. So it could just be the company. But I think a different style of organized play is necessary for these cooperative events. And frankly, I really like the limited idea that you have of, if you open up the packs and I don't know, some of the cards are dungeon cards and some of them are hero cards. You just take all the dungeon cards and push them into the middle and shuffle them all together. And like, that's the dungeon that your pod of drafters have to play through. And you could even get something really fascinating where, we think about draft in a way of how can I make my deck the best and how can I prevent other people from getting good cards. In a cooperative thing, a draft could be more like, I know that player's playing rogue, so I'm gonna like pass this really good rogue card over to that player because I can't play it, or it's less effective in my deck or something. So I think there's a lot of really potentially really neat space to explore, but I think the industry is just coming back to the idea of what limited play is. The living card game model took us all away from limited play. And I think they're only now coming back and saying, oh yeah, people like drafting and people like sealed events. So how can we reintegrate those back into our games? I don't think there's a lot of companies that are looking to innovate on those limited formats yet.
I think that's where there's going to be a lot of growth there. And I think, our shared idea there of having that sort of limited cooperative experience might be such an interesting and unexplored niche that we really haven't dived into yet. And I hope that, somebody is actually exploring that idea right now, because I think it would be a really interesting experiment, at least in the glow of the conversation that we've had so far. So like, that really begs the question. We've talked about what collectible games or collectible distribution models and PvE can sort of offer one another. But I guess that sort of leads me to the question, like, what do we see in the future? Obviously, we mentioned that Flesh and Blood is going to be bringing out their own sort of cooperative or PvE or player versus environment experience, what do you think we should see in the future for this particular type of model when it comes to collectible or trading card games? Do you think it's even a good idea at all? Like, tell me what you think.
So once again, I'm going to like dust off my crystal ball and see what is revealed to me. But I'm guessing that there are a lot of eyes in the industry on Flesh and Blood right now, for all kinds of different reasons. One of which is just, how does a game break into, the like mythological realms of the top 3 card games? Like, how do you actually get a card game and get it into even the same order of magnitude as those others? And how do you make collectors happy with cold foils and things like that while not alienating players, having multiple copies of the same card, but with different foil effects on them so you can make the collectors happy and the players happy. And I think the eyes are on Flesh and Blood for how this 2.0 experiment is received and how the player versus environment is rolled out and how successful that ends up being. Does it grow the community a lot? Is it, just how valuable is it? So I'm guessing that a lot of what we can expect to see in the future is either people copying the successes of Flesh and Blood, assuming it is successful. Then I think it's going to take some time to see any innovation on that. Because I'm guessing there are going to be card games that already exist that are just saying, how can we take that new cool thing and bolt it onto our existing game, as opposed to like what you and I are suggesting of creating a whole new game that's designed for this weird roguelike random deck experience.
It's really fascinating, and I'm super excited to see what happens. I mean, I obviously, we talked about Pokemon supporting it through these digital print and play models. Maybe, perhaps, if Flesh and Blood is successful, they start to explore that realm more and more what is possible there. Like, obviously, we could have things like, gym leader decks that, this comes out and that comes out and whatever. And Magic could go back to this sort of challenge deck, but use it in a more, multiplayer capacity even. I'm super excited to see what the future really holds as far as grafting this sort of philosophy onto the games that we already know exist. But what I'm really looking forward to, what I really want to see, is the game that sort of comes out learning the lessons from possibly what Flesh and Blood does, learning the lessons from how the other games respond to it, and comes out as an original game in this capacity, like as an original game that is happy to serve not only the competitive side of play, but also the cooperative side of play. And I think that that's such an exciting and tantalizing idea moving into the future of the collectible game sort of model. And it's something that we haven't properly seen so far. Obviously, we talked about tons of examples in this episode about how they've sort of, tried to semi-integrate it. But I think every single year that passes, we've learned new things. We've learned, just in the last sort of decade about things like people want to play things like Commander. We're even hypothesizing right now about a roguelike collectible game space thing. Like, how did market values and everything sort of change when it comes to this sort of like these randomized decks? Obviously, things like Magic sort of experimented in this space with things like Conspiracy, where it's like the cards, are only good for when you're drafting them. So it could be something that's really interesting. And, there's even an idea, like the idea of player versus environment could also extend with these cards beyond that. There's things like, the Mario Maker video games where people can create their own levels for Mario. Hey, if I put a deck list online for a dungeon deck, you've got to see how many points of your deck can go against to beat it. What's the lowest possible number of card points that you can use to beat my dungeon deck or whatever? And it could become sort of this whole communal thing based around cooperative play, but also have this competitive bent in the way that people play it. And I'm so excited for the future. Do you have any final thoughts about the way that PvE is going to be embraced in the future, or even just collectible games and PvE in general, Brett?
Well, honestly, I'm just so excited to see how it unfolds, very much in the same way you are. Because, when the living card game model came out, I really drank the Kool-Aid hard.
You and me both.
Where I said, this is the future. Like, this is how we're going to proceed. Like, this is how the card game industry is going to look forever. And it was weird to have those assumptions shaken down to their very core. And I still live in this, I still have this idea in my head of PvE games are narrative experiences that have you play through a scenario, and that has to be presented in an entire, boxed unit. You can't split up the novel. But, that's really an old way of considering it. And so I'm so excited to see those who are maybe a little more creative than I am play around with that. And I really hope there is community support for companies and creators that want to play around in that space.
So what we need to do is, what you're saying is, we need to create like a surrealist card game or a William S. Burroughs inspired card game where everything is happening all at once and it doesn't matter. And, things maybe make even more sense when things are happening non-linearly.
Sounds reasonable to me.
So that has been fantastic. And I love this conversation. I can't wait to revisit it in 5-10 years time when we've seen sort of the impacts of everything we're talking about today. I feel like we're only at the precipice of what cooperative games and the randomized distribution model can offer us. Now, before we go out, tell me about what's emblazoned on your shirt. Tell me about where people can find the Librarians card game, and even find, that blog I mentioned that I've loved checking in on from time to time recently. Tell me all about that, Brett.
So Librarians adventure card game is kind of this older style game that we've been talking about, of playing through narrative as characters from the TV show. And the basic idea of the TV show is modern world, but magic is real. And all the myths and legends surrounding magic of King Arthur and enchanted swords, all of that is real, but the public doesn't know about it. And they don't know because there are people who are keeping them safe and keeping magic out of the hands of those who would do harm. And those are the librarians, right? And it's a group that has to use their brain and knowledge of mathematics and dead languages and history and architecture and all of these things to defeat the bad guys. There is a little bit of, punching and kicking that goes on too, but it's mostly how can you outsmart your opponent. So you can find out more about the game at everythingepic.com, I think.
Or via the links in the description.
Yep.
And what I'm so excited about is, just tell me, I am curious, does your game feature its own sort of deck building mechanics, or is everything sort of come sort of like, this is the character deck for this particular character? Tell me, unpack how that works for people who might be more used to a more trading card or collectible card game model.
Yeah, that's a great question. So it kind of straddles the line between trying to serve both audiences. That if you look at a game like Arkham Horror is a great example. There's a lot of deck building in that game. You have to build a deck to play the first scenario. That scenario gives you experience that you spend on new cards, and now you're doing deck building again for that. And I think that drives a lot of players away. Players who want the narrative experience, but not building decks over and over and over again. And so the Librarians kind of uses a shuffle building strategy where you have a set of cards that is connected to your character, maybe a little bit like Marvel Champions. And then you can pick 3 additional sets of cards to shuffle together into your deck. So you have some ability to customize it, but if you want a card, you have to take the whole group of cards together. And then finally, each mission you go on, you'll find either allies or magical artifacts, and you can take some of those unlocked cards and shuffle them in as well.
Well, that sounds so exciting. And like I said, all the links will be in the description for the game. Check that out as it sort of starts to come out. Like I said, there'll be hobby stores starting to get it. It's going to be something you're going to find in a mass wide release. So take a look. Thank you so much for this very exciting conversation. And obviously, as I said, we are standing on the precipice of an entirely new adventure for the card gaming genre and the collectible card gaming space in the next decade or so. You know, you can go back and have a look. I had a previous episode about the way I think licenses are going to be engaged in the future, but this episode acts as a companion to that, as what we can see mechanically from these particular games and how they're going to innovate and move forward. You know, when you think about it, you step back and you think, this industry has only been around for 30 years, since 1993, since, you know, Magic the Gathering was a twinkle in Richard Garfield's eye. We haven't really seen the full extent of it. You know, it took them 30 years of film to get to color. I can't wait to see what the next few years do in the trading card and collectible card game space, because as things start to evolve, are we going to see app-enabled games? Are we going to see completely different games? Are we going to see, you know, like an entire rebirth of the living card game genre as it's sort of seen the cycle before? So thank you so much for joining me and Brett on this amazing episode that of the Rare Slot. Remember, check out the core episodes of the Booster Pack. I very much would appreciate if you go check out one of the other episodes we might have mentioned, or even just have a look through the catalog, because we might have something in there that interests you, maybe a card game that you used to play. Thank you so much. Goodbye from me. Goodbye from you, Brett.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Oh, it's been an absolute pleasure, my friend. All right. Thank you so much. And until next time, remember, keep shuffling. And there you have it, our episode all about player versus environment, or, as they say, cooperative gameplay with Brett Schofield. Thank you so much to Brett for joining us and sharing his opinions and that history about player versus environment in collectible games. And I honestly am so excited about some of the future that we sort of hypothesized on in this particular episode, because I think that there is so much space to still explore when it comes to player versus environment and trading card games. I honestly cannot wait to see what comes of it. So that's about it from me. Thank you so much. Remember, obviously, check the links in the description for Brett's game, the Librarians adventure card game. You're going to see a bunch of the mechanics we mentioned throughout this episode and philosophies that we mentioned represented in that game. And be sure to also find his blog as well, that you'll be able to see linked in the description, that where he just talks about his adventures in tabletop gaming and some really interesting stuff. You know, V-Test, he mentioned how much he liked the Vampire, the Eternal Struggle game. He talks about that a lot on there. So go check that out. It's actually really cool place to check out some card game stories. Now, the other thing is, please let me know. Brett told me that he wants to hear about player versus environment, and we actually had a fantastic episode about it. So I want to hear from you. What kind of trading card games do you want to hear the history of? What kind of topics do you want to hear discussed? Let me know via the YouTube comments. Let me know via my social media, which is facebook.com/CCGHistory, or where you'll find me more often, twitter.com/CCGHistory. A follow on either of those, or a like on either of those, or even a subscription on YouTube is so valuable to going and bringing more episodes. And as well, I should mention, if you want to send me something a little bit more long form, tell me a story, or even just reach out to me in general, you can find me via my email address, which is theboosterpack@CCGHistory. It'll, of course, be linked in the description, and you can find it there. The other thing I want to mention is, if you could, if this is your first time joining the show, or, you know, you're only, you know, relatively new to the show, go back and check out some of the older episodes we've had in this feed, because there might be something there that you really want to hear about, whether it's a topic-based conversation, sort of like this one, or perhaps even just a game like, you know, the World of Warcraft game that we talked about in this episode. I talked to Justin Gary about his time sort of working adjacent to that, and how one of his ideas actually inspired the very raid decks that we were talking about today. Go back and have a look. We talked to John Zinza about some of the history behind Legend of the Five Rings. I talked to some people about the way the Spellfire game was made. I talked to a couple of creators about the Verse system game. There is so much to explore if you go back and have a look at our catalog of episodes on this feed. It would mean so much to me if you could. All right, that's about it from me. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode. I would just love to hear from you in this particular capacity, whether you just let me know what you thought or whatnot. I can't wait to just hear what you have to say. And I also cannot wait to bring the very next episode of this show to you, which will be a regular sort of normal booster pack episode with a creator from a collectible card game of yesteryear, or maybe even multiple collectible card games. So that's about it. Until next time, I have said it once and I have said it again. Thank you for joining me on the bonus episodes of the booster pack, the Rare Slot. I have been Rands. Remember, keep shuffling.